Selah had always known she was different, but she never realized just how much until the day they abandoned her. The Varelians were a proud race, towering beings with silvery skin that shimmered like moonlight. Their strength was unmatched, their telepathic abilities far beyond anything a human could imagine. Emotions were considered a weakness, and the Varelians prided themselves on their control. The strong ruled, and the weak were discarded. Selah, though, had never been like the others. Her family was part of the highest noble class in Varelian society. Her father, a powerful leader, and her mother, a renowned scientist, were revered across the galaxy. From the moment she was born, Selah had been expected to live up to the legacy of her bloodline. But unlike the others, Selah didn't fit the mold. She had always felt emotions more deeply than the others. While the other Varelians communicated silently, their minds locked in perfect harmony. Selah's thoughts were a storm of colors and sensations. When she was young, her parents had been proud of her abilities. Her telepathic potential was greater than most. But as she grew, it became clear that her mind wasn't like theirs. While the others could easily block out feelings, Selah's mind couldn't. She felt everything. The joy, the sadness, the anger, the love. Everything bled into her thoughts, each emotion sharper and more powerful than the last. At first, it was overwhelming, but as she learned to control it, she found that the emotions were not something to fear. They were a part of her, just like the rest of her abilities. But in the cold, strict society of the Varelians, emotions were a weakness. Feelings were something to be suppressed, not embraced. Selah's empathy, her ability to understand the hearts of others, was viewed as a flaw. It made her a liability, a potential threat to the perfect order of the Varelian Empire. Her family had been the first to notice. Her telepathy is weak, her father had said one evening, his voice low and stern as he stared at her from across the table. She cannot control it. She feels too much. She will never be like the others. Her mother, once so kind and understanding, had joined in. She is a failure. She cannot be a part of this family. If she cannot control her emotions, she cannot belong here. Selah had tried to fight it. She had practiced for years, learning to silence her thoughts, to push the feelings away. But no matter how hard she tried, they always slipped through. Her mind was a river that refused to be dammed, always flowing, always shifting. The day her family made their decision, Selah had stood in front of them, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what they were going to say, but a small part of her had still hoped, had still believed that maybe, just maybe, they would understand. Her father's voice was cold. Selah, you are no longer part of this family. You are a weakness, a liability. Your failure reflects poorly on us. Her mother, her eyes cold and empty, had nodded in agreement. We have no place for you. Selah's chest tightened. She had always thought her family would stand by her, would support her no matter what. But now, in this moment, she realized just how little they cared for her. To them, she was nothing more than an inconvenience, a mistake they needed to discard. Without another word, they had turned their backs on her. The guards had come next, cold-eyed Varelian soldiers who took her away without a single glance of sympathy. They brought her to a small, forgotten moon, one that had no name in the Varelian records. It was a barren rock, with little more than dust and broken ground to keep her company. "This is where you belong now," one of the guards had said, his voice emotionless as he shoved her towards the ground. "A place for those who are weak." Selah had fallen to her knees, the cold dust biting into her skin as the guards turned and left her behind. She had tried to call out, but her voice had been swallowed by the emptiness of the moon. The stars above seemed distant, unreachable. For the first time in her life, she felt truly alone. Days passed, though it felt like weeks. Selah had no way to measure time. The endless gray sky stretched on forever, and the silence pressed down on her like a heavy weight. She ate what little she could find, but food was scarce, and hope was even scarcer. It wasn't until the third day that she had finally collapsed, exhaustion and hunger taking their toll. Her body felt like it was made of stone, too heavy to move. Her mind, once sharp and alert, had begun to blur. She no longer knew how to survive. That was when she saw it. A glint in the distance, a flash of metal against the dull horizon. A ship. Scylla's heart raced. For a moment, she wondered if it was another group of Varelians, come to finish what they had started. But then, as the ship drew closer, she saw the shape of it. A small craft, worn and battered, but unmistakably different from the sleek Virelian warships. She didn't care who it was. She didn't care if they were friends or enemies. She just needed help. As the ship landed in front of her, the ramp lowered, and a figure stepped out. It was a human. Scylla's mind raced, and for the first time in days, she felt something other than fear. The human stepped off the ship with a cautious but steady stride. He was taller than Scylla had expected, his body rugged and built for survival, not the sleek, graceful design of the Varelians. His clothes were simple, worn from travel, and his face was covered in stubble, a roughness that seemed at odds with the smooth, perfect features of her own people. Scylla, weak from hunger and exhaustion, barely managed to lift her head to look at him. Her mind buzzed with questions. Why was he here? Was he another enemy, sent to finish the job her family had started? Or could he be someone who had come to help her? "Hey," the human said, his voice rough but warm. His accent was unlike anything Scylla had ever heard. "You all right?" Scylla didn't answer at first. She couldn't. Her throat felt dry, and her heart pounded in her chest. She had been abandoned, thrown away like garbage, and now here was a strange human, speaking to her as if he cared. The man took a few cautious steps closer, his eyes scanning her carefully, as if assessing the situation. He knelt down in front of her, lowering himself to her level. Scylla flinched at his closeness, but didn't back away. She had no strength left to do so. "Don't worry," he said, his tone calm. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm here to help." Scylla looked at him through half-lidded eyes, trying to make sense of his words. He seemed sincere, but her mind was clouded with doubt. She had been lied to before. Hadn't her own family done the same to her? The man reached into a small pouch attached to his belt and pulled out a water flask. "You look like you need this more than I do." Her parched lips tingled at the sight of it. Without thinking, Scylla's hand shot out, trembling, and took the flask. She drank greedily, feeling the cool water slide down her throat, filling her with a strange sense of relief. The man watched her silently as she drank, his face softening with a quiet understanding. When she finished, he set the flask aside and looked at her. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, his voice gentle. Scylla's eyes flickered up to meet his, though her gaze was still wary. She shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I was abandoned." Abandoned. The human's brow furrowed in confusion. By who? She swallowed hard, trying to push down the emotions that were rising in her chest. She had tried to block the memory of her family's cruel rejection, but hearing the question made it all come flooding back. They threw me away." Her voice cracked, and she quickly looked away, ashamed. "I am not like them. They think I am weak." The man didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes filled with something Scylla couldn't quite place. Finally, he spoke, his voice firm but not unkind. "That's not true. You're not weak. No one should be treated like that." Scylla felt a strange warmth in her chest at his words, though she wasn't sure what to make of it. No one had ever spoken to her like that before, especially not someone from another species. She had been taught that humans were inferior, just primitive beings, lesser than the Varelians. Yet, here this human was, speaking to her as if she mattered. "You're a human, aren't you?" she asked hesitantly. The man nodded, his lips curling into a small smile. "Yeah, I am. The name's Daniel. I'm a scavenger. I go from planet to planet, picking up what I can find." Scylla blinked. A scavenger. She had heard of humans doing such work, but never had she imagined one would be here on this forsaken moon. "Why did you come here?" she asked quietly. There's nothing here. No one comes to places like this. Daniel's smile faded, and he looked out at the barren landscape. I've been traveling for a long time. I was just passing through when I saw your ship in the distance. I thought I could maybe help. Sela didn't understand. Help? Why would he want to help her? She was nothing to him. She was weak, abandoned by her own kind. She was a failure in the eyes of the galaxy. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? How could she explain that she didn't belong to anyone anymore? That the people who had been meant to care for her had cast her aside without a second thought? Daniel seemed to sense her struggle. Hey, I'm not asking you to trust me right away. I know you've probably had a rough time. He paused, his expression softening. But I can't just leave you here. You deserve better than this. Sela's heart skipped a beat. No one had ever said that to her before. The Varelians had told her she was worthless. Her family had abandoned her. Yet here was this human, this stranger, offering her something she hadn't dared hope for. Kindness. Her mind spun with conflicting emotions. Fear, disbelief, hope. None of them made sense. But at that moment, as she sat in the dust of the barren moon, she felt something she hadn't felt in so long. The smallest spark of hope. I don't know what to do, she admitted, her voice small. Daniel gave her a reassuring smile. You don't have to know right now. Just take it one step at a time. We can figure things out together. Sela stared at him for a long moment. His words were simple, but they carried an unspoken promise. For the first time since her family had turned their backs on her, she felt like maybe she wasn't as alone as she had thought. Daniel reached a hand out to her, his eyes gentle. Come on. You need to rest. We'll get you somewhere safe. Sela hesitated, her gaze shifting from his outstretched hand to the empty, silent moon around them. Everything in her told her to be cautious, to keep her distance. But she was too tired, too broken to keep fighting. Slowly, hesitantly, she placed her hand in his, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The days passed in a blur. The barren moon, once cold and unforgiving, became a distant memory as Sela found herself aboard Daniel's ship, the Wayfarer. It wasn't much to look at: scratched metal panels, wires hanging loose, and a small cargo hold that had seen better days. But to Sela, it felt like a home. It was a place where she wasn't seen as a mistake or a weakness. It was a place where she was allowed to be herself. Daniel had kept his word. He gave her food, water, and a place to rest. The small gestures of kindness were something Sela hadn't experienced in so long, and they confused her at first. She wasn't used to people caring for her without expecting something in return. In her world, everything had always come with a price. But here, with Daniel, it was different. Every day, she learned something new. He showed her how to fix the ship's broken systems, how to use the scanners, and even how to prepare simple meals from the supplies he had stored. Sela had never been taught these things by her own people. The Varelians prided themselves on intellect and control, not on the everyday skills that made survival possible. They had always expected perfection, which meant that mistakes were never tolerated. Here, on the Wayfarer, mistakes were a part of learning. Sela still had trouble understanding how a human like Daniel could accept her flaws so easily. How could he look at her, someone who had been discarded like trash, and treat her with such respect? The more she saw, the more she realized how little she knew about humans. They were different from the Varelians in almost every way, but there was something about them that fascinated her. One afternoon, as they sat together in the cockpit, Sela glanced over at Daniel. He was focused on the ship's controls, adjusting settings as they sailed through the empty space. The calmness in his movements was something she had never seen before. The Varelians were always calculating, always in control. But Daniel seemed to take each moment as it came, without worrying about the future or what might go wrong. How do you stay so calm? Sela asked, her voice curious. Daniel chuckled, glancing over at her with a smile. I've been through a lot in my life. Worrying about things you can't control doesn't help. You just do your best and take it one day at a time." Sela thought about his words. It was strange to her. Her life had always been about control, about making sure everything went according to plan. To her, worry was a part of that control. It was a way to make sure she wasn't vulnerable. But Daniel's calmness wasn't about avoiding vulnerability. It was about accepting it and moving forward anyway. She didn't understand it, but something about it felt right. It felt human. The next few days, Sela began to observe Daniel more closely. She watched how he interacted with the world around him. He didn't shy away from the messy parts of life. He didn't hide from failure. And he didn't let anything stop him from moving forward. It was on the 5th day, as they sailed past a quiet moon, that Sela started to understand. They were sitting outside the ship, watching the stars as they passed by. Daniel had built a small campfire from scraps of metal and wood, and the warmth of the flames was a welcome change from the coldness of space. "Why are you helping me?" Sela asked quietly, staring at the fire. She had asked him this question before, but it was never answered the way she wanted. This time, there was something different in her voice, something that made her question everything she thought she knew. Daniel looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know. I guess I just feel like everyone deserves a second chance, and when I saw you, alone out there, I thought you deserved one too." Sela's heart fluttered in her chest. She had never been treated like this, not even by her own family. Her thoughts felt heavy, and her emotions were swirling inside her. What did it mean to have a second chance? Did she even deserve one? "I'm not like you," she said softly, her voice tinged with self-doubt. "I'm not like the others. My family threw me away. They said I was weak." She hesitated before continuing, the words feeling like a weight on her chest. "I'm different." Daniel didn't seem surprised by her confession. Instead, he leaned closer to the fire, staring into the flames. "I'm different too. Everyone is. No one is the same, and that's what makes us unique. But that doesn't make us weak. It just makes us human." Sela listened closely, trying to make sense of what he was saying. She had spent so many years trying to fit into a mold, trying to be someone she wasn't, just to gain acceptance. But here, in the presence of a human, she felt like she could be something more than she had ever been before. She felt like she could be herself. "You're not weak, Sela," Daniel continued, his voice gentle but firm. "You're strong because you've survived. You fought to stay alive even when your own family turned their backs on you. That's strength." He paused for a moment before adding, "Sometimes strength isn't about being perfect. It's about accepting who you are, flaws and all." The words hit her like a wave. She had spent so long hating the very parts of herself that made her different, her empathy, her emotions, the things that set her apart from the Varelians. But Daniel's words gave her a new perspective. Maybe she had been wrong all along. Maybe the things she thought were weaknesses were actually her greatest strengths. Sela sat quietly, letting the warmth of the fire fill her. She had been taught that emotions made her less powerful. She had been told that being different was a curse. But now she wasn't so sure. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling foreign but real. Daniel smiled at her, a genuine smile that made her chest feel lighter. "No need to thank me. You don't need to change to be accepted. You just need to be you." And for the first time in a long time, Sela felt a flicker of hope deep inside her. Maybe, just maybe, she could learn to be who she truly was, and be okay with it. Days turned into weeks, and Sela began to feel like she was truly starting over. Life aboard the Wayfarer had its challenges, but it also had moments of peace. With Daniel by her side, she found herself slowly healing from the pain of her past. There was something about the ship's gentle hum as it traveled through the stars that made her feel as though she were on a journey to a new life, one where she could find out who she really was. Daniel was patient with her, always ready to teach or offer advice. He even showed her how to navigate the stars using the ship's outdated charts. Scylla had never imagined she would learn to read star maps, but now she found herself fascinated by the endless expanse of space. Yet, as the days passed, a nagging feeling began to grow in Scylla's mind. It wasn't something she could easily explain, but there was a constant sense of unease in the back of her thoughts. The Varelians, her family, they were powerful, far beyond what most beings could imagine. Would they come looking for her? Would they find her and bring her back to the place where she had once been rejected? The thought haunted her, but she didn't dare voice it to Daniel. She didn't want him to think she was afraid. But one quiet evening, when the stars outside the ship looked like scattered diamonds against the endless black, that feeling grew stronger. "Daniel," Scylla said hesitantly, her voice breaking the silence. "I'm worried." Daniel glanced up from the controls. His face, usually calm and relaxed, now showed a hint of concern. "Worried about what?" She swallowed, trying to find the right words. "About the Varelians. My family. I don't know if they will just let me go. I'm afraid they'll come after me." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady. "You're not alone, Scylla. I'll protect you. I won't let them take you back." Scylla nodded slowly, though her mind wasn't entirely at ease. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that she had found safety, but the reality of her situation was something she couldn't easily shake off. The Varelians didn't let go of their own, especially not someone like her. They had already shown her how easily they could cast her aside. What would stop them from doing it again? Suddenly, a loud alarm blared through the ship, cutting off her thoughts. Daniel was instantly on his feet, his hands flying over the controls. Scylla's heart raced as she turned to look at the screen. "What's happening?" she asked, fear creeping into her voice. "Someone's approaching," Daniel said, his voice tense. "And they're coming fast." Scylla's stomach dropped. She knew instantly what that meant. She didn't need to ask who it was. The Varelians had found them. "Is it them?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel didn't answer immediately. His fingers danced across the control panel, trying to access the ship's scanners. But the readout on the screen only confirmed what they both feared. "It's a Varelian ship," he said grimly. "They're closing in." Scylla's heart pounded in her chest. Her body tensed, every instinct telling her to run, to hide, to do anything to escape. But there was nowhere to go. The vast emptiness of space surrounded them, and the Varelians were relentless. "What do we do?" Scylla asked, her voice shaky. Daniel didn't hesitate. He knew the stakes, and he wasn't about to let Scylla face this alone. "We outrun them." Scylla's eyes widened in disbelief. "Outrun them? They're faster. They'll catch us." Daniel gave her a determined look. "Not if I have anything to say about it." He activated the ship's engines, pushing them to their limit. The Wayfarer lurched forward as the hum of its engines grew louder. Scylla braced herself against the sudden force, her grip tightening on the armrest. Her mind raced. What would happen when the Varelians caught up to them? Could they survive a fight, or would they be forced to surrender? "They're gaining on us," Scylla said, her voice filled with fear. "We can't outrun them for long." Daniel gritted his teeth. "We're not just going to outrun them. I'm going to make them think we're just another piece of junk drifting through space." Scylla blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" Daniel's eyes glinted with a hint of mischief. "I've got an idea." The ship was speeding toward a nearby asteroid belt, a dangerous and unpredictable place where the rocks and debris scattered across space made navigation treacherous. The Varelian ship was close behind, its sleek form flashing in the distance. Daniel's plan was risky, but it was their only chance. "We're going to take a sharp turn into the asteroid field," Daniel explained. "The Varelian ship won't be able to follow without risking damage. They'll think we're just an old ship that can't be bothered with." Scylla's heart pounded. She didn't know if she was ready for something this dangerous, but she had no choice. She had to trust Daniel. "Hold on tight," he said, his voice steady. This is going to get rough. Without another word, Daniel veered the ship sharply to the left, heading straight into the asteroid field. The ship jolted as it dodged large rocks and smaller debris that flew by at breakneck speed. Scylla gripped the seat with all her strength, trying to steady herself as the ship weaved and twisted through the dangerous path. Behind them, the Virelian ship followed, but they were slower, more careful as they navigated the chaotic field. Scylla could see them on the scanners, their ship slowing down as it avoided collision after collision. "We're losing them," Daniel said, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. "Just a little more." Scylla's stomach churned as the ship dipped and swerved, narrowly avoiding a massive asteroid. Her heart was in her throat as she looked out the small window. The Virelian ship was now far behind, unable to keep up with the Wayfarer's unpredictable movements. "We did it," she said, a breathless laugh escaping her lips. "We actually did it." Daniel slowed the ship as they left the asteroid field behind. The stars outside seemed calmer now. The immediate danger passed. But Scylla knew it wasn't over. The Virelians would keep coming for her. She had to be ready. Daniel turned to her, his eyes serious but filled with determination. "We can't stop here. We need to keep moving. I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe, Scylla. But we need to stay ahead." Scylla nodded, her heart still racing. She didn't know what the future would hold, but one thing was clear: Daniel wasn't going to give up on her. And neither would she. The Wayfarer continued to race through space, weaving between stars and planets, its worn engines working harder than they ever had before. Scylla's heart still raced from the close call with the Virelian ship. Her thoughts were a swirl of confusion and fear. She had escaped, but for how long? The Virelians weren't known for giving up easily. They would hunt her down if they had to. And there was no place in the galaxy that could guarantee safety forever. As they moved deeper into uncharted space, Daniel kept his focus on the controls, his face calm but his eyes sharp. He was a man who had seen too much to let fear control him. Scylla, on the other hand, was still learning how to live without constantly looking over her shoulder. Every passing moment felt like it might be their last. But even in the midst of uncertainty, there was something that began to change in Scylla. It was subtle at first, a quiet hope, like the first hint of dawn after a long night. She had spent so many years hiding her true self, trying to meet the impossible standards of the Virelians. But with Daniel, she was learning that survival wasn't about being perfect. It was about being strong enough to face the unknown, no matter how difficult it seemed. "What's the plan?" Scylla asked one morning, as she sat in the cockpit, watching the stars streak by. They were far from the asteroid field now, but the constant hum of the ship's engines reminded her that they were still running. Daniel glanced up from the controls, his hand steady. "We need to lay low for a while. The Virelians will probably think we're trying to hide somewhere close by, so we'll keep moving. There's a system up ahead. Might be a good place to lay low for a bit." Scylla nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The Virelians might be far behind for now, but they would be searching. They were too advanced, too relentless, to give up on her easily. "You don't think they'll find us?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. Daniel didn't meet her gaze immediately. His focus remained on the controls, but she saw a brief flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "I'm doing my best to keep us off their radar," he said, his tone reassuring but lacking the certainty she wanted to hear. "But even I don't know what they're capable of. The Virelians are a different kind of enemy. We can't underestimate them." Scylla felt the weight of his words. She had always underestimated the Virelians, believing their coldness was just another sign of their strength. But she had learned the hard way that their indifference wasn't just a personality trait, it was a weapon. They saw everything as a tool to be used, and anyone who didn't fit their idea of perfection was discarded. Her heart twisted at the thought. She had been one of those discarded tools, thrown away like trash. But now, she wasn't alone. She wasn't abandoned. "We'll make it," she said, her voice firm despite the uncertainty in her heart. "We have to." Daniel looked over at her, his gaze steady. "We will. Together." As they approached the system Daniel had mentioned, Sela began to feel a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. She had never imagined a future like this. She had never imagined there could be people who would fight for her, who would give her a chance when no one else had. The system was quiet. It was a small cluster of planets, uninhabited and mostly ignored by passing ships. Perfect for hiding. Daniel set the ship down on one of the moons, a desolate place with rocky terrain and little to offer in the way of resources. It wasn't much, but it was safe, for now. "We'll stay here for a while," Daniel said as they began to prepare the ship for a longer stay. "It's remote, and it'll be harder for the Varelians to find us." Sela nodded, but as she watched Daniel work, a new thought crept into her mind. What if they never found a place that was safe for long? What if they had to keep running forever? The fear was still there, lurking at the edges of her thoughts. "Are you sure this is enough?" she asked. "What if they find us here too?" Daniel paused for a moment, looking at her with a calmness that made her feel both safe and small at the same time. "I don't know how long we can stay hidden, but I do know this. We're not just running anymore. We're fighting for something. We're fighting for you." The words hit Sela harder than she expected. She had never really thought of herself as something worth fighting for. But here, in the silence of this remote moon, with only Daniel as her ally, she started to see things differently. "Fighting for me," she repeated, her voice soft. Daniel gave a small smile. "You deserve more than to be thrown away. You're not just some piece of trash, Sela. You're worth something. And as long as I'm here, I'll make sure you know that." Sela felt her chest tighten, emotion she hadn't known she had rushing to the surface. She had spent so many years being told she was weak, that she was nothing. But here, in this moment, surrounded by the vast emptiness of space, she felt a strange sense of belonging. She wasn't just a discarded experiment. She was someone. She was Sela. The next few days passed in a quiet rhythm. Daniel taught her more about the ship, and they worked together to keep it running smoothly. There were moments of calm, moments when Sela almost forgot about the danger outside. But deep down, she knew it was only a matter of time before the Varelians found them, and when they did, it would be a battle for survival. One evening, as they sat outside the ship, looking at the stars, Daniel turned to her, his face serious. "We can't stay here forever," he said. "We need to think about what comes next. We need a plan." Sela nodded. She understood. Hiding wouldn't keep them safe for long. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the future. She wasn't afraid of what might come. With Daniel by her side, she felt stronger than she had in years. Together, they could face whatever the Varelians threw at them. "We'll figure it out," she said, her voice steady. "We'll make a future for ourselves." Daniel smiled, a rare, genuine smile. "We will. Together." And in that moment, with the stars shining above them, Sela finally believed it. The moon was quiet, its barren surface stretching out in every direction. The only sound was the soft hum of the Wayfarer's engines as it rested in a small valley, hidden from view. Sela sat outside, her back against a rock, staring up at the vast sky. The stars seemed so far away, distant and untouchable. It was a reminder that no matter where they went, the universe was enormous, and they were just two small dots in it. Despite the quiet, an unease lingered in the air. The Varelians hadn't given up. Sela could feel it in her bones, even though they hadn't yet shown themselves. It was only a matter of time before they found her. The galaxy was vast, but not vast enough for her to disappear forever. Daniel had been right. Hiding wasn't the answer. They couldn't run forever. Sooner or later, they would have to face the Varelians head-on. She sighed, leaning her head back, her mind wandering. It wasn't just the Varelians she had to worry about. It was herself. For years, she had been trained to follow orders, to be part of a system that cared nothing for her individuality. She had been taught to be perfect, to fit in, to not question the greater purpose. But now she was learning to question everything. What do I want? The question floated in her mind, as simple as it was complicated. She had spent so many years trying to live for others that she had forgotten how to live for herself. She had no clear answer, but she was starting to realize that maybe that was okay. Maybe she didn't need all the answers right away. She had time, and she had Daniel. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. She turned to see Daniel walking toward her, his expression thoughtful. "How's the ship?" she asked, trying to push the weight of her thoughts away. "It's holding up," he said, his tone steady. "But we can't stay here too much longer. We need to find a place where we can make repairs and get supplies. The Varelians are still out there, and sooner or later, they're going to get too close for comfort." Sela nodded, her gaze dropping to the rocky ground beneath her. She knew he was right. The longer they stayed in one place, the easier it would be for the Varelians to track them down. "What's the plan?" she asked, looking up at him. "We head to a nearby system," Daniel replied. "It's a little more populated, which means we'll blend in better. We'll keep a low profile and restock while we figure out what to do next." Sela felt a small sense of relief. A populated system meant more chances for them to disappear in the crowd. It felt like a step in the right direction. "How long until we get there?" she asked, standing up and brushing off the dirt from her clothes. "About 2 days if we keep the speed steady. I'll set a course now." Sela followed Daniel back into the ship, where the familiar hum of the engines filled the air. It felt oddly comforting, like a heartbeat in the dark void of space. As Daniel worked at the controls, Sela took a seat nearby, staring at the star map on the screen. The stars seemed to beckon them forward, but there was a part of her that still hesitated. What if the Varelians were waiting? What if this was just another trap? The thought sent a chill down her spine, but she shook it off. She couldn't let fear control her. She had a chance at a new life now, and she wasn't going to give that up without a fight. 2 days later, the Wayfarer glided smoothly into the new system, its engines humming as they passed through the outer rim. The stars here were different, brighter and closer together, like the light at the end of a tunnel. It was a hopeful sight, but Sela couldn't let herself get too comfortable. This was only a temporary stop. They needed to gather supplies, make repairs, and then leave again. The system was home to a few colonies and trade routes, mostly made up of miners and traders. It wasn't the kind of place where the Varelians would waste their time looking for a runaway, but Sela still kept her guard up. If the Varelians had learned anything from their last encounter, they would be even more relentless in their pursuit. Daniel guided the ship toward a nearby station, a small bustling hub that seemed to be just the kind of place they needed. It was the perfect spot to blend in. The station was busy, with ships coming and going, and people hurrying between the docking bays. "We'll dock here and find a place to lay low for a while," Daniel said as they approached the station. "I'll handle the repairs, and you can take a look around. Just don't draw attention to yourself." Sela nodded, a sense of purpose settling over her. She hadn't been out in the world much since escaping the Varelians, and the idea of exploring this new place, even just for a short while, was exciting. It was a world where she could be just another face in the crowd, a world where no one knew who she was. The ship settled into its assigned docking bay with a soft thud, and they both exited the Wayfarer and stepped into the bustling station. Sela took a deep breath as the station's atmosphere hit her, an odd mix of recycled air, food, and machinery. It was strange, but also comforting. It felt like the start of something new. "Stay close," Daniel reminded her as they walked through the crowded corridors. "We don't want to draw any attention." Sela nodded, keeping a low profile as they made their way toward the central market. The place was alive with activity, people haggling over goods, traders shouting about their wares, and the hum of energy all around them. Sela couldn't help but feel a rush of excitement. This was what freedom felt like, being able to walk through a place without constantly fearing someone would recognize her. Daniel led her to a small corner of the market where they could buy supplies without drawing attention. While he took care of the transaction, Sela wandered a little, her eyes scanning the crowd. It was hard to relax completely, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of hope. This might be their moment, the one chance to truly escape the Varelians. But she knew it wouldn't last forever. They had to keep moving, keep fighting, and stay ahead of whatever came next. As she turned back to Daniel, her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden commotion, a loud crash from a few aisles over. Sela's heart skipped a beat as she watched a group of rough-looking men shove their way through the crowd. One of them was shouting, but the rest of the noise drowned out his words. Something about the situation didn't sit right with Sela. She could feel her instincts kicking in, warning her that this wasn't just a random disturbance. "Daniel," she started, her voice tight with unease. Before she could finish, one of the men's eyes locked onto hers. The chaos in the market grew louder as the group of men pushed their way through the crowd. Sela's heart beat faster. She instinctively took a step back, but her eyes stayed fixed on the man who had locked eyes with her. There was something in his gaze, something that didn't sit right with her. "Stay close," Daniel muttered, his voice low and urgent as he placed a protective hand on her shoulder. The man's gaze never left Sela. His companions were causing a disturbance, knocking over crates and shouting at the people around them, but he seemed entirely focused on her. Sela felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She wasn't sure who they were or what they wanted, but she could tell from the way the man moved that he wasn't just a random troublemaker. He had a purpose, and it had something to do with her. "Is there a problem?" Daniel asked calmly, his voice steady as he tried to assess the situation. The man didn't respond at first, continuing to stare at Sela with a strange intensity. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but full of authority. "You're the one they've been searching for. You're the one who escaped." Sela's blood ran cold. She knew exactly who he meant. The Varelians. Daniel took a step forward, his body positioning itself between Sela and the man. His hand went instinctively to the small weapon at his belt, but he didn't draw it yet. "I don't know what you're talking about," Daniel said, his tone firm. But the man only smiled, a cruel smile that sent a chill through Sela's body. "Don't play games. We know who you are. We know you're hiding her. And we don't take kindly to traitors." Sela's mind raced. How had they found her so quickly? How did they know where she was? She couldn't afford to panic. She had to think clearly. But the fear was there, clawing at her insides. The Varelians had never been this close before, and they were more dangerous than ever. "We need to go," Sela whispered to Daniel, her voice tight. She was already thinking of the escape routes, the nearest docking bay. But the man's men were everywhere, and escaping wasn't going to be easy. Before Daniel could respond, the man signaled to his companions. Without warning, the group moved forward, pushing past the people in their way. The market was starting to clear out as people fled in fear. Daniel grabbed Sela's arm, pulling her toward a narrow alley between two stalls. "We have to move fast," Daniel said, urgency in his voice. "Stay close." The two of them darted down the alley, their footsteps echoing in the silence that followed the chaos. Sela's mind raced. She had to think of a plan, but her thoughts kept circling back to the one thing she knew for sure. The Varelians weren't going to stop until they had her. As they reached the end of the alley, Daniel glanced back toward the market. He was scanning for any sign of the Varelian agents, but they had lost the element of surprise. They were on the run now, and there was no turning back. "We can't outrun them forever," Daniel said, his voice grim. "We have to stand our ground." Sela hesitated. Her first instinct was to keep running, to keep escaping. But she knew Daniel was right. The longer they ran, the more likely they would be cornered. It was time to stop hiding. "Let's make our stand here," Sela said, her voice low but filled with determination. She felt a new strength building inside her, a sense of power she hadn't felt before. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about taking back control of her life. Daniel turned to her, his eyes searching her face. "Are you sure about this?" Sela nodded. Yes, we can't keep running. They quickly found a small, abandoned storage area near the alley. It was a perfect place to make their stand. There were crates stacked against the walls, providing some cover, and the narrow entrance gave them the advantage if anyone tried to come after them. As they prepared for what was to come, Sela took a deep breath. She wasn't the same person who had been thrown away by the Varelians. She wasn't the broken experiment they had tried to mold. She was more than that now. She was free, and she would fight to protect that freedom. It wasn't long before they heard footsteps approaching. Heavy, purposeful steps. Sela's heart skipped a beat. The Varelians were here. "I'm ready," she whispered to Daniel, her hand gripping the edge of a crate. Daniel gave her a quick nod. "We hold them off as long as we can. We have to protect the ship. If they get to it, we're done." The door to the storage area swung open, and the group of Virelian agents poured in, their weapons drawn. The leader was at the front, a smug look still on his face. He didn't seem to expect much of a fight. "You've made a mistake," he said coldly. "This is where it ends." Sela didn't flinch. She stood tall, meeting his gaze with a confidence she hadn't known she had. "No, this is where it begins." In a flash, Daniel fired first. A sharp, controlled shot that sent one of the agents tumbling to the ground. The others reacted quickly, but Daniel and Sela were ready. They fought with everything they had. Sela with a newfound strength and determination, and Daniel with the precision and skill of someone who had been through countless battles. The fight was intense, but they weren't giving up. They weren't running anymore. Sela could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she kept her focus. Every move, every shot, was made with purpose. The Varelians might have had the advantage of numbers and technology, but they didn't have what she had. They didn't have the will to fight for their freedom. One by one, the Virelian agents fell, retreating back into the shadows as their leader realized they were losing. The smug look disappeared from his face as he surveyed the scene, the tables having turned. "Retreat," he ordered, but it was too late. They had underestimated Sela and Daniel. Breathing heavily, Sela lowered her weapon, watching as the remaining agents fled. She felt the adrenaline slowly fading, replaced by a sense of relief. They had won. For now, they were free. As the last of the Varelians disappeared, Daniel turned to Sela, his face a mixture of exhaustion and pride. "We did it," he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Sela nodded, her heart still racing, but now with a sense of triumph. "Yes, we did." And for the first time in a long while, she felt a true sense of hope. They had made their stand. They had won. And the future, whatever it held, was theirs to fight for.